Today we're going to be taking a look at direct and indirect object pronouns, which in Spanish are known as complementos de objeto directo y indirecto. First, I want to take a look at how we speak in English. For example, if we're posed with the question, who did you give the gloves to? We can respond, I gave the gloves to Mom. However, in English, we normally avoid repetition in speaking as part of our fluency in the language. We don't like repeating the same things over and over again. So if we look at the first two sentences, what we're repeating that we don't have to repeat is the gloves. So we'd normally respond in English, who did you give the gloves to? I gave them to Mom. Them meaning the gloves. Of course, when we're speaking, we know them is referring to the gloves. Now in Spanish, we also try to avoid repetition in speaking by using indirect object pronouns. For example, ¿a quién das las guantes? Las doy a mamá. Las replaces las guantes as a direct object pronoun. ¿Quién compró los boletos? To figure out what is the direct object pronoun, we must ask ourselves what receives the action of the verb. In this case, the verb is comprar. So what in this sentence is receiving the action of being bought? Los boletos. So here are our direct object pronouns in Spanish. We have me, te, lo, and la, nos, os, los, and las. A lot of these are actually really easy to remember, especially lo and la and los and las, which you'll use most often as direct object pronouns. The only one you have to be careful with is lo. Lo replaces el. The rest of them all follow the same pattern. La, los, las. But lo replaces el. So here on the side I have a few questions. I want you to pause the video now and practice replacing the pronouns. If you're having trouble, ask yourself, what is receiving the action of the verb? Okay, let's take a look at these. So, hablo contigo. What is receiving the action of being spoken here? I am receiving the action, contigo, or you are rather. So it will be te hablo. Doy las flores. What is receiving the action of being given? Las flores. Las doy. Veo el pasaporte. I look at the passport. What is receiving the action of being looked at? El pasaporte. Lo veo. Tomas el taxi. Lo tomas. Comen las manzanas. Las comen. Now, we also have indirect object pronouns, and this is where it starts to get a little more complicated, so you have to pay close attention here. For example, in the question, ¿das las flores a mamá? Instead of asking what receives the action of the verb, in this case, the question means, do you give the flowers to Mom? We know what receives the action of the verb is the flowers. That's what's being given. We have to ask ourselves now, what is the direction of the verb? What direction is it going in? So if we're giving something to where? In this case, we're giving something to Mom. That's why she becomes the indirect object pronoun. Here are the indirect object pronouns in Spanish. They're a little bit simpler than the direct object pronouns. So we have me, te, le, nos, os, and les. Very important here is to notice in the third person singular and plural, it's le and les. It doesn't matter if it's male or female, a group of males, a group of females, they only have one pronoun, le and les. So on the side here I have some questions. I want you to pause the video and ask yourself, what's the direction of the verb? And when you have the direction, you'll know what the pronoun is. So first we have traigo las manzanas a ti. So I bring the apples to you. What's the direction of the verb? To you. So it's te traigo las manzanas. Compro un chaleco para él. So I buy a jacket for him. Now we know what's receiving the action is the jacket. That's what's being bought. The direction is para él, to him. So, le compro un chaleco. Dicen sus problemas a nosotros. I tell my problems. No, they tell their problems to us. The direction is to us. Nos dicen sus problemas. Haces la tarea para mí. Me haces la tarea. Pago el recibo a ellos. Les pago el recibo. Placement of pronouns is very important, and you may have already picked up on this. When there is just one conjugative verb, the pronoun comes before the verb. For example, los compro, no los compro, yo no las tomo, ellos no te habla. Or te hablan, rather, sorry. It gets a little more complicated when we have compound verb forms. Here we have two options. Los quiero comprar, we can either put the pronoun before the first conjugative verb, or quiero comprarlos. We can attach it to the infinitive. Now, as you guys remember, when we have two verbs in Spanish together, the first one gets conjugated, the second one does not. Lo estoy haciendo, this of course is the present progressive tense, which we've already learned, or estoy haciéndolo. If you choose to put it at the end, you do need to add an accent to the ando y endo part of the verb. La estás tomando or estás tomándola. Again, an accent is necessary here. Now, whether you choose to put the pronoun before or at the end, it doesn't matter. Both are equally correct. You can mix and match and do it whichever way you feel like doing it. I personally like putting it at the end because it sounds, I guess, a little more fun because it's not something we do in English. Now we come to the difficult part, double pronouns. It's really not that difficult, but it is a little more complicated. We're not actually going to do this in class for a while yet, so if you'd like to stop here, you certainly may do that. So double pronouns are, for example, if we have the question in English, are you giving the flowers to mom? We can respond, I am giving the flowers to mom, but we're repeating the flowers and to mom. We're repeating a lot of things here. It sounds kind of ridiculous if you think about it. So normally what we would say in English is, I am giving them to her. Both them and to her are object pronouns in English. And we can do the exact same thing in Spanish. It's a little more complicated in Spanish because the placement becomes very important. Now, if you think about it in English, we say, I am giving them to her, but we cannot say, I am giving to her them. It sounds really strange, and the same thing applies in Spanish. The pronouns must go in a very particular order. For example, traigo las manzanas a ti. We have to ask ourselves what receives the action of the verb. To figure out what is the indirect object pronoun and what is the direct object pronoun, we have to ask ourselves what receives the action of the verb and what is the direction of the verb. As we know that whatever receives the action is the direct object pronoun, and whatever is the direction is the indirect object pronoun. Here it's very important to remember, when deciding what goes first, people come first. Indirect objects are usually people. People come before things in indirect and direct ordering. Now in English, things come before people. In Spanish, it's the exact opposite. Going back to our example, I give them to her. Them, the thing, comes before her, the person. In Spanish, it's exactly reverse. Another important thing to remember is when you have two L sounds together, the le, les changes to se. Some examples. If you have le los, it becomes se los. Les nos, se nos. It doesn't matter if it's le singular or les plural. If you have two L sounds together, they both change to se. So I have a few examples here. I want you to ask yourself what receives the action of the verb and what's the direction of the verb, and how do you put the two together? You may pause the video now if you'd like. Okay, let's take a look. So traigo las manzanas a ti. So I bring the apples to you. So what receives the action of being brought? The apples. And what's the direction? To you. So we have te las traigo. Compro un chaleco para él. So what receives the action of being bought? La chaleco, the jacket. What's the direction? To him. So we have se lo compro. We have to remember that para él would normally be le, but because we would have two L sounds together, the le changes to se. So instead of le lo compro, it's se lo compro. Dicen sus problemas a nosotros. So what receives the action of being spoken? Sus problemas. What's the direction? Nosotros. So nos los dicen. Haces la tarea para mí. So what receives the action of being done? La tarea. What's the direction? I am. So me la haces. Pago el recibo a ellos. So what receives the action of being paid? El recibo. The direction? Them. Se lo pago. Of course here, a ellos would normally be les, but because we'd have les lo pago, we have to change the les to se. The placement of pronouns here is important as well. The same rules apply as before. For example, me los quieres comprar, or quieres comprármelos. Important here is that if you have double pronouns and you want to put them on the end of an infinitive, you will need to add an accent. Te lo estoy haciendo o estoy haciéndotelo. Again, we need the same accent on the present progressive tense that we had before. Se la está sacando. Está sacándosela. So it's a mouthful. The reason for this is because the stress of a word can never fall upon the pronoun, which in this case is se la. So we have to maintain the original stress of the word. So we have, if we pronounce that without the pronouns, it's sacando. So just because we're adding things to the end, the pronunciation isn't going to change, which is why we do need an accent to maintain the stress in the exact same place.